Sarah's voice trembled as she stood at the bakery counter, her worn coat pulled tight against the evening chill, her eyes fixed on the glass case filled with beautiful birthday cakes she could never afford. And she swallowed her pride before whispering to the young clerk, "Excuse me, do you have any expired cakes? Anything from yesterday, or even older? It's my daughter's 7th birthday tomorrow, and I just want her to have something special." And the words hung in the air like a confession, shame coloring her cheeks as the clerk's expression shifted from confusion to pity, while just 3 feet behind her, hidden by a display of artisan breads, stood Richard Sterling, a man worth $42 million, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, who had stopped mid-reach for a baguette, his hand frozen in the air as those words expired cake. Daughter's birthday pierced through the armor he'd built around his heart for the past 5 years. Sarah hadn't noticed him, hadn't noticed anyone really, because when you're drowning in poverty and desperation, the world narrows to a single point of focus. And right now that focus was giving her little Emma one moment of childhood joy in a life that had offered precious few of them. The apartment where they lived had peeling wallpaper and a heater that only worked when it felt like it. Sarah worked 2 jobs, morning shifts at a laundromat and evening cleaning at an office building, but Emma's medical bills from her chronic asthma consumed almost everything. The inhalers and medications and emergency room visits forming a mountain of debt that grew taller every month. And Sarah's ex-husband had disappeared 2 years ago, leaving nothing but broken promises and an empty bank account. So here she stood, asking for expired food, her dignity pooling at her feet like water from her threadbare coat. The clerk, a girl no more than 19, with kind eyes and a name tag that read Sophie, bit her lip and glanced toward the back. I think we have a small cake from yesterday that we were going to toss. It's just a basic vanilla with buttercream. Nothing fancy. I could let you have it for $3. And Sarah's face lit up like someone had handed her the moon, her hands already fumbling in her purse, counting out crumpled ones and quarters. Yes, oh yes, thank you so much. That's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. And Richard watched this exchange, feeling something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the ice that had encased his emotions since the day he'd buried his own daughter, Lily, who would have been 12 now, who had died in a car accident along with his wife on a rainy Tuesday that had rewritten the entire definition of his existence. He'd built his fortune in real estate and investments, but after the accident, money became not a tool for living but a wall to hide behind. Work consumed him. Charitable donations were made through assistance. Human connection felt like touching fire, and he'd convinced himself that detachment was survival, that caring about nothing meant nothing could hurt him again. But now, listening to this stranger with holes in her shoes count out coins for a discarded cake, something ancient and buried stirred within him, the part of him that used to be a father, a husband, a man who believed the world could be good. Sarah carefully accepted the white bakery box, holding it level with both hands like it contained glass. My Emma is going to be so happy. She thinks we can't afford a cake this year. She told me it was okay, that she understood. But what 7-year-olds should have to understand that? And Sophie smiled sadly. I hope she has a wonderful birthday. And Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening. I'm going to make it wonderful. I've been saving to get her this book she wanted, about a girl who goes on adventures, and I made her a dress from fabric I got at the thrift store. It's not much, but she knows she's loved. That's what matters, right? And Richard felt his throat tighten because he remembered Lily's 7th birthday, the extravagant party with a pony and a magician and a custom cake shaped like a castle. And he would trade every dollar he had, every property and stock and asset, for one more chance to see her blow out those candles. As Sarah left the bakery, clutching the box and a small bag of diode rolls Sophie had quietly added as a gift, Richard made a decision that surprised him. He followed her, not with any plan or intention, just an inexplicable pull. a need to understand, to witness, to maybe remember what it felt like to care about another human's story. He kept his distance as she walked 4 blocks to a bus stop, waited in the cold for 15 minutes checking her watch, anxiously because she had her cleaning shift in 2 hours and needed to get home and spend time with Emma first. And when the bus came, Richard slipped into his Mercedes parked nearby and followed its route through neighborhoods that grew progressively more worn, buildings with barred windows and cracked sidewalks, until Sarah got off and walked into a 5-story apartment complex with graffiti on the walls and a broken front door that didn't lock. Richard parked across the street, feeling like an intruder but unable to leave, and he sat there as evening deepened into night, watching the lit window on the 3rd floor where he'd seen Sarah enter, imagining the life happening behind that glass. And he thought about his own penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, its designer furniture that no one ever sat on, its silence that echoed like a tomb. And he realized he couldn't remember the last time those walls had heard laughter or felt like a home rather than a museum of his grief. Around 8 o'clock, he saw the light in the window shift, shadows moving, and he wondered if Emma was going to bed, if Sarah was tucking her in, reading her a story, doing all those small, sacred things that parents do, the things he'd taken for granted until they were ripped away. And he sat there in his luxury car in this forgotten neighborhood and wept for the first time in 3 years, his shoulders shaking, his carefully constructed composure crumbling, because watching this mother's fierce love for her daughter reminded him that he'd once been capable of feeling something other than numbness. The next morning, Richard did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He canceled all his meetings, ignored the phone calls from his assistant, and drove to a toy store, where he walked the aisles, feeling lost and overwhelmed by the explosion of colors and sounds, realizing he had no idea what 7-year-old girls liked anymore. Technology had changed, trends had shifted, and he stood there in the doll section feeling ancient and disconnected until a store employee asked if he needed help, and he heard himself say, "It's for a little girl's birthday. She's 7. She likes books and adventures." And the employee, a grandmother with warm eyes, smiled and led him to a display. "These are popular stories about brave girls who solve mysteries, go on quests, make a difference." And Richard bought an entire series, then added art supplies, a stuffed animal that looked like it was made for hugging, puzzles, games, a warm winter coat in a size the employee helped him guess, new shoes, and before he knew it, he'd filled an entire shopping cart, his credit card barely registering the damage because what was money for if not this, if not bringing joy to a child who deserved every good thing. But as he loaded the bags into his car, doubt crept in. Who was he to insert himself into their lives? Would Sarah be offended, suspicious? Would this seem like pity, like some wealthy man playing God? And he sat in the parking lot paralyzed by uncertainty until he remembered Emma, a child he'd never met, but who'd spent her birthday eve thinking a second-hand dress and a used book were riches. And he decided that his discomfort didn't matter, that this wasn't about him at all. So he drove back to that neighborhood in the daylight, which looked even more weary and forgotten in the sun, and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, apartment 3C, where children's voices echoed in the hallway and the smell of cooking mixed with mildew hung in the air. He knocked, and after a moment, Sarah opened the door with flour on her hands and surprise on her face, clearly not expecting visitors. And Richard realized how he must look: expensive suit, polished shoes. So obviously out of place in this building, and he suddenly felt foolish. But before he could speak, a small voice called from inside, "Mama, is it someone for the party?" And a little girl appeared at Sarah's side, thin and pale with huge brown eyes, and wearing the homemade dress her mother had mentioned, pink fabric with slightly uneven stitches but made with such obvious care. And Richard's breath caught, because for just a second, in the angle of her smile, she reminded him of Lily, Not in appearance, but in that quality all children have, that openness to joy, that resilience that makes them capable of finding wonder in the smallest things. I'm sorry to intrude, Richard began, his prepared speech evaporating. I was at the bakery yesterday. I overheard you, and he trailed off, seeing Sarah's expression shift from confusion to recognition to mortification, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh God, you heard that? I'm so embarrassed. I didn't mean, but he shook his head quickly. No, please, don't be embarrassed. I was moved. I lost my daughter 5 years ago. She was 7, and I heard you talking about Emma's birthday, and I know this is strange. I know I'm a complete stranger, but I bought some things, and I'd really like to give them to her. If you'd allow it, not as charity, but as a way for me to honor my daughter's memory by celebrating yours. And the honesty in his voice, the rawness of his grief laid bare in that dingy hallway, made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. And she looked down at Emma, who was watching this tall, sad man with curiosity rather than fear. And Sarah made a decision that came from the part of her that still believed in the kindness of strangers, in moments of grace that arrive unexpectedly. And she stepped back, opening the door wider. Would you like to come in? We were just about to have cake. The apartment was tiny, maybe 500 square feet total, with a living room that doubled as a bedroom. Sarah's blankets folded neatly on the couch, and small, separate bedroom for Emma filled with drawings taped to the walls, and stuffed animals that had seen better days. But it was clean and cared for, every surface scrubbed. Flowers from the supermarket in a jelly jar on the table. Colorful paper chains that Sarah and Emma had made together strung across the ceiling. And Richard saw that poverty hadn't diminished this mother's determination to create beauty and celebration for her child. And he felt humbled by the richness of love that filled these humble rooms, a richness his mansion utterly lacked. Emma was shy at first, hiding partially behind her mother. But when Richard brought in the bags from his car making 3 trips while Sarah protested weakly, and Emma's eyes grew wider with each load, the little girl's reserve melted into pure, unfiltered delight. She unwrapped each gift with reverence, gasping at the books, hugging the stuffed elephant, trying on the coat that fit perfectly. And she looked up at Richard with such genuine happiness that he had to turn away to compose himself, his heart simultaneously breaking and healing. The pain of remembering Lily mixed with the unexpected gift of witnessing Emma's joy. Sarah was overwhelmed, torn between gratitude and pride. This is too much. I can't accept all this. We don't need charity. But Richard sat down at their small table, his expensive suit incongruous on the second-hand chair, and said with quiet intensity, "Please, you'd be doing me a kindness by accepting. I've spent 5 years avoiding life, avoiding connection, building walls around myself. And yesterday, hearing you in that bakery, seeing your love for your daughter, it reminded me that I used to be human, that I used to understand what mattered, and I've forgotten. I've been so lost in my grief that I've forgotten how to be anything but empty." And this, he gestured around at the modest party preparations, the expired cake now, sitting beside the gifts. "This is more real, and more full of love than anything in my life has been for years. So please, let me be part of it. Let me remember what it feels like to celebrate something that matters." Sarah sat down across from him, studying his face, seeing the grief etched there, the loneliness that money hadn't been able to fix, and she reached across the table and took his hand. This stranger who'd appeared at her door like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. What was her name? "Your daughter." And Richard's voice cracked as he answered, "Lily. She was 7. She loved butterflies and singing and making up stories. She was afraid of the dark but brave about everything else. And she died because a driver ran a red light, and my wife died trying to shield her. And I survived without a scratch, and I've never understood why. I've never understood what I'm supposed to do with this life I didn't deserve to keep." And the words poured out, 5 years of locked-away anguish, and Sarah listened with tears running down her face. Still holding his hand, and Emma, sensing the sadness, came over and climbed into Richard's lap without permission or hesitation, the way children do when they recognize pain and respond with instinctive compassion, and she patted his cheek and said, "It's okay to be sad. My mama cries sometimes too, but then we do hugs and it helps," and she wrapped her small arms around his neck. And Richard held this fragile child who wasn't his daughter, but who needed love just as desperately as he needed to give it. And something inside him that had been frozen and dead began, impossibly, to thaw. They had cake together, the expired bakery vanilla that Sarah had bought for $3. And Richard said it was the best cake he'd ever tasted because it was served with joy instead of obligation, with love instead of duty. And Emma told him about her favorite subject in school, art, and how she wanted to be an illustrator when she grew up, drawing pictures for the kinds of books she loved to read. And Richard listened with genuine interest, asking questions, encouraging her dreams, slipping naturally into the role he'd thought he'd lost forever, the role of someone who cared about a child's hopes and future. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah told him about their struggles, not complaining but simply sharing the medical bills, the jobs that barely covered rent, the constant anxiety of one emergency away from homelessness, the guilt she carried about not being able to give Emma the life she deserved. Richard listened without judgment, without the impulse to immediately fix everything with money, understanding that sometimes people need to be heard more than they need to be rescued, but also forming a plan, a way to help that would preserve dignity and empower rather than create dependency. Before he left, as Emma played with her new art supplies at the table, Richard said to Sarah quietly, "I own a property management company, among other things, and I have a building downtown that needs an on-site manager, someone to coordinate maintenance, handle tenant relations, show apartments. It comes with a 3-bedroom unit and health insurance, and I think you'd be perfect for it if you're interested. It's not charity. It's a real job that I genuinely need filled, but it would mean better housing for you and Emma, and the insurance would cover her medications." And Sarah stared at him, afraid to believe. "Why would you do this? You don't know us." And Richard glanced over at Emma, humming to herself as she drew a picture of a butterfly. "Because yesterday I was going through the motions of living without actually being alive, and you reminded me that there's still good in the world, that there are still things worth showing up for. And because I think Lily would want me to help if I could, I think she'd be disappointed in the man I've become, shut off and isolated, and maybe this is how I start finding my way back." Sarah took the job, and it transformed their lives in ways both practical and profound. The apartment was bright and clean with heat that worked and windows that locked. Emma's bedroom had space for a real bed and a desk for her artwork. The health insurance meant Sarah could finally take her to a specialist who adjusted her medications and reduced her emergency episodes. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she could breathe, like they were building toward something instead of just surviving day to day. But the greater transformation happened in Richard, who began stopping by the building regularly. At first under the pretense of checking on operations, but really to see Emma and Sarah, to hear about Emma's school projects, to share meals at their table, to slowly rebuild his capacity for connection and joy. He started volunteering at Emma's school, funding an art program that had been cut from the budget. Not anonymously, but actually showing up, working with the kids, remembering what it felt like to be needed and useful in ways that mattered more than profit margins and quarterly reports. And the other parents were wary at first of this wealthy businessman in their underfunded school. But they saw how he listened to their children, how he encouraged and supported without condescension, how he looked at these kids from struggling families and saw not problems or statistics but potential and worth. And slowly he was welcomed into a community he'd never known existed in his insulated world of wealth. On the anniversary of Lily's death, a day Richard had spent alone for 5 years. Sarah and Emma invited him to dinner, and afterward, Emma presented him with a drawing she'd made, a butterfly with rainbow wings and a little girl riding on its back, flying toward the sun. And she said, "This is Lily. Mama told me about her, and I think she's happy and flying, and I think she wants you to be happy too." And Richard hung that drawing in his penthouse, the first personal item in that sterile space, and whenever he looked at it, he felt connected to both the daughter he'd lost and the life he was learning to rebuild. And he understood that grief didn't have to be the end of love, that honoring Lily meant living fully, loving openly, showing up for the people who needed him, and allowing himself to need them in return. Months passed, then a year, and Richard became part of Sarah and Emma's family in a way that had no formal definition, but felt as real as any blood relation he was at. Emma's 8th birthday party, her school concerts, her art show where her butterfly paintings won first prize, and he established a foundation in Lily's name that provided support for single mothers struggling with medical debt, offering not just financial assistance, but job training, childcare, and mentorship, creating pathways out of poverty for hundreds of families. And he ran it personally, not through intermediaries, interviewing applicants himself, hearing their stories, seeing their strength, and remembering the woman in the bakery who'd asked for expired cake with such love and desperation that it had cracked open his heart. And Sarah worked alongside him, her lived experience and compassion making her invaluable, her own journey from desperation to stability, giving hope to others walking that same path. And she discovered talents she hadn't known she possessed for organization and advocacy, returning to school part-time to get a degree in social work, building a career that gave her purpose beyond survival, and watching her daughter thrive in ways that had once seemed impossible. Emma, healthy and confident and full of dreams that no longer felt out of reach, on what would have been Lily's 13th birthday. Richard visited her grave for the first time in 2 years, bringing butterflies he'd raised from caterpillars in a kit Emma had given him, releasing them above the headstone as a symbol of transformation and hope. And he talked to his daughter, telling her about Sarah and Emma, about the foundation, about how her death had nearly destroyed him, but her memory was now saving him, teaching him that love doesn't end, it just changes form, and that the greatest way to honor those we've lost is to love those who remain with everything we have, to show up, to stay open, to let our broken hearts become doorways to compassion rather than walls of isolation. And as the butterflies danced in the sunlight, he felt a peace he hadn't known since the accident, not the peace of forgetting or moving on, but the peace of carrying his loss while still choosing life, still believing in goodness, still trusting that even expired cake shared with love is a feast, and that sometimes the most valuable things we own aren't the ones we buy but the connections we build, the lives we touch, the moments we show up for each other in our mutual brokenness and find that together, somehow, we're whole.